Amen. The longest serving Associate Justice of the Supreme Court was William O. Douglas. He served for 36 and a half years. What I really find interesting about him is that he loved country music. And not only did he love country music, but he collected country music lyrics. And so his favorite album was entitled Songs I Learned at My Mother's Knee and Other Joints. Some of his favorite all-time lyrics were, number one, when the phone doesn't ring, you'll know it's me. Number two, walk out backwards so that I'll think you're coming in. And number three, my wife ran off with my best friend, and I sure do miss him. A few years ago, there was a sentimental country song that came out entitled A Long Line of Love. It's a young man singing to his fiancée because she's gotten cold feet, and she's not totally convinced that their love will last. And so his response to her is to sing to her about the marriage of his parents, and then to sing about the long marriage of his grandparents before them. And then he goes into this line, forever is in my heart and in my blood. I come from a long line of love. Today is, in the Church of Jesus Christ, Epiphany Sunday. And I want to remind you this morning that we come from a long line of Epiphany people. 40 years ago, when I came into ministry, I preached my first Epiphany sermon at West Fairview Church. And on that afternoon, I got a phone call from one of the members of my congregation, one of the women in the church. And she said to me, "Preacher, what's all this Epiphany stuff about?" She said, "I went home and my husband and I pulled out our Bible and we looked, and the word Epiphany isn't in here anywhere." And you know, she's right. Epiphany, the word, does not appear in Scripture. It's a word we use to describe something that does appear in Scripture time and time and time again. Epiphany means to reveal, or a manifestation, a revealing. And it talks about the fact that we serve a God who delights in revealing himself to his people. So that time and time and time again throughout the history of Scripture, we see a God who reveals himself to his people. And you and I come from that long line of Epiphany people. During this season of Epiphany, the church historically has focused on two events from the life of Christ. I think most of you are aware that the church operates on a liturgical calendar that is somewhat different than the calendar the rest of the world uses. The liturgical calendar revolves around the events in the life of Jesus. So during the season of Epiphany, which is fairly brief, just a couple of weeks, we focus on the coming of the wise men when God revealed himself to the Magi, men who were not Jewish, and so therefore Gentiles. So this is the revelation of God to Gentiles like us. The other event from the life of Christ that we focus on during the Epiphany season is the baptism of Jesus. Because you'll remember that when Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist, there's an epiphany that takes place. The voice of God is heard to come out of heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased." So God repeatedly reveals himself during the life of Jesus, but throughout the entirety of Scripture, we have many, many epiphanies. Perhaps the first one you find in the book of Genesis. We're told that God would come and walk with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day and talk with them. An epiphany, a revelation of God. We know that Abram had an epiphany in which God called him to leave the land of Ur of the Chaldees and follow him to where he would lead him to a land of promise that was almost 1,000 miles away from home. We know that God revealed himself to Moses at the burning bush. Moses sees this bush that is on fire and approaches, and the Lord speaks from the bush and says, "Remove your shoes, because you're standing on holy ground." We know that when Mary was a young teenage girl, the angel of the Lord came and said to her, "Fear not." And he brings her this message that she shall bear the very Son of God. We know that her husband, Joseph, also has an epiphany from the Lord, but his is not an angel visit. His is in a dream. Time and time and time again, God reveals himself to God's people. In the ministry of Jesus, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and there in front of them, Jesus is transfigured. And not only is Jesus transfigured, but they see then Jesus speaking with the greatest prophet from Israel's past, Elijah, and the great lawgiver Moses there on the Mount of Transfiguration. And you hear that voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." Time and time and time again throughout Scripture, you have these epiphanies that take place in the lives of God's people. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, likewise had an epiphany. May 24, 1738, in London, John Wesley went to a Bible study of all things and is sitting there, and he's listening as someone reads a book that was written by Martin Luther. And suddenly John Wesley was later to record in his journal, "I felt my heart strangely warmed, and I knew that God loved me, even me." And based on that epiphany, the whole direction of John Wesley's life was to change forever. Folks, let me just say to you that there is not just one kind of epiphany. The one thing we learn from Scripture is that God reveals himself in many different ways. Sometimes through a star, sometimes through the voice of an angel, sometimes with a voice out of heaven, sometimes with a warm heart. We're told in the Old Testament about a time when God reveals himself through a speaking donkey. When Balaam is headed down the road to do something that is contrary to the will of God, and suddenly that donkey that he's riding on sees something ahead that Balaam cannot see. And so his donkey that he has ridden since childhood veers off the road and over into the field. And Balaam gets off and beats the donkey, not understanding what's taking place. He gets back on the donkey, they go down further, and they come to a narrow part in the road, and again, the donkey sees the angel of the Lord standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand to kill him. And the donkey takes and he goes over as close to the wall as he can, and he actually crushes Balaam's leg against the wall as he tries to avoid death. And Balaam again gets off the donkey and beats it with a stick. And finally, the third time, the angel of the Lord is standing in the most narrow part of the road. And the donkey can't escape any direction he wants, and so he simply goes down on all fours. And Balaam gets off a third time and beats his donkey. And at that point, God opens Balaam's eyes after opening the mouth of the donkey and saying, "Here I have served you all the days of my life faithfully, and now you beat me. I have saved your life these 3 times." And at that point, God opens his eyes. Epiphanies take place in all kinds of ways. There is not one size suits all. But we serve a God who delights to reveal himself to his people, including me and you. And your epiphany may not look anything at all like these. The Apostle Paul is going on that road to Damascus when suddenly there's a bright, blinding light from heaven, and his epiphany with God takes place, leaving him blind. The one thing we can say about epiphanies is that they're all different. The second thing we can say about epiphanies is that in every case, God reveals himself to call God's people to serve him. The purpose of epiphanies is to call us to serve the Lord. I may not know what your particular epiphany has been, but I do know that God has called you to serve him in some way. Immediately after the 11 o'clock service, Marty and I are going to hit the road for Ohio to go out and visit my brother-in-law, who's scheduled to have a heart transplant in the next couple of weeks. He is, and I apologize to any engineers in the congregation, but he has a PhD in engineering, and he is one of those guys that can get lost inside of his own head. And we've gone on vacation with them numerous times, and the 4 of us, his wife, my wife, and I, and he are driving along together, and we have this conversation about, okay, we're going to stop next, or where we're going to eat next, or whatever. And we're going down the road, and there's the place we decided we were going to stop. And he's completely oblivious, because he's not been a part of that conversation at all. He's been somewhere lost in his head. His wife says that she has come to the point after all these years of marriage where she almost has to go up and grab his head and make sure he makes direct eye contact with her to make sure he truly is listening to what it is that's being said in that moment. Epiphanies are an opportunity for God to grab our attention. And God grabs our attention so that we might serve him. Don't know what your epiphany has been, but chances are, if you're like most Americans, I think there was a survey done at the end of 2009. The overwhelming majority of American people say that they have experienced an encounter with God. Well, folks, in Scripture, when you encounter God, it's because God is calling you to serve him in some particular way. I'm not sure how God might be calling you to serve him, but I do know he is calling. Let's bow in a word of prayer.